No food, no friends, no life, no talent or skill, no job, and certainly no girlfriend. That's the life of the worst student at the Exorcist Academy. Julia Curtis is a pathetic loser who has nothing going for him. The boy is betrayed by his closest allies and channels 99% of I will survive energy to basically grind for 2 years in one of the most dangerous zones. When he returns to humankind, he is not a human, but a force to be reckoned with. Watch until the end of the video to discover his powers. A defeated boy surrounded by a horde of monsters is rendered at a complete loss. He only wanted to become someone who could help his allies, following in the footsteps of his respectable father, who swore his life to protect the world. The boy didn't seek to become a hero of any kind, and merely wanted to become someone who could always protect others. That is the only thing he desired. A few hours back, we are told how he found himself in such a predicament. In the hustling and bustling city, the boy woke up from his slumber. Julia Curtis, a sophomore at Exorcist Academy, found himself lethargic. He mustered the ability to get out of bed, despite his tired state. He recalls that over 150 years back, humanity was actually defeated by the demon race. Humanity was driven away and subject to a different terrain, where they built a city known as the Barrier City. Outside of this city is actually an all-encompassing and never-ending Twilight. This Twilight is the home and controlled territory of the most demonic creatures who terrorize the lands. I guess plot armor for humanity doesn't exist in this universe. Humans spent their lives fighting against the demons of the outside world, and they found themselves building an Exorcist Academy to nurture talents for the cause. Humanity hoped to regain the light of the world that had been stripped and taken away from them in the dark and mystical Twilight. Julia Curtis dons his uniform and reflects that this, too, was his goal as a student of the Academy, in an effort to try and work his way up to save humanity. He turns to his family's portrait and bids them farewell before stepping outside. Julia reflects that his father was an exorcist who valiantly fought against the demons and met his end, while Julia was still a young boy. His mother, on the other hand, met her demise from an epidemic that spread around the same time. Julia reflects that he didn't feel lonely, as his ambitions were to become a great exorcist in the footsteps of his father. Arriving at his academy, Julia is greeted by his fellow companions. The Exorcist Academy features combat classes. Combat refers to hunting demons outside of the Barrier City, and although it's a dangerous task, they still have to undergo training and experience, so that they may one day become a proper exorcist. Julia is concerned about their state and wonders if they will be alright, since they've never done something like this before. Julia's friends alleviate his concerns and emphasize that they will take the steps necessary to protect each other. They are relying on Julia for his healing and support, as well as distracting the demons with his illusion magic. There is also the reward factor, as hunting demons in the danger zone will allow them to gain a reputable boost from the Academy, upgrading their ranks. The prospect of becoming famous and reputable is why his friends are so intrigued about becoming S-ranked exorcists. Julia reflects that the S-ranked exorcist is the high and mighty rank that all students want to reach. It's a rank that supersedes the regular division of exorcists, ranked to E. In fact, the S-ranked exorcists are widely believed to be humanity's hope in their fight against the creatures of the Twilight. This sounds cool and all, but Julia thinks he is just a normie E-ranker who has never met an actual S-ranked exorcist in real life. His friends told him that they'll report the mission status after returning to the Academy. Of course, this is a massive disservice to the boy who is contributing to the mission, but his so-called friends are only using him to reap the rewards and remind him that he should remember their difference in ranks. The poor boy sulks and accepts their terms. Ro is getting ripped off instead of being boosted to higher ranks. What an L. After some time, they enter the danger zone. Julia points to the demonic critters crawling about. Dan calls them claw lizards and prepares his weapon to hunt them down. Dan and his team advance forth and slice open the claw lizards with ease. That is until they realize that an entire horde of claw lizards is waiting to strike them down. Julia warns them against the monsters. Dan tells him to become the decoy so that they can strike from behind. Julia, of course, objects to this strategy, but ultimately decides to take them at their word to save his team. He maximizes his physical enhancement abilities and rushes past the claw lizards. In Julia's solo advance, he uses illusion magic to ward off the claw lizards and actually impresses the rest of his team with his incredible abilities. His team isn't worried, though, because they were planning to ditch him all along. Surprise, motherfudger energy. The poor boy was ruthlessly forming a defense for his allies and couldn't hear the words of Dan, who was planning to leave him behind. After his brutal assault, he managed to slay every claw lizard that surrounded him. The victor was an exhausted Julia, who realized that his friends ran off without even joining the battle. They never returned for his sake, and that's how Julia realized that they had taken advantage of him and had escaped the danger zone. The betrayed boy was used as a decoy, but he wasn't surprised because he always expected something like this to happen someday. Bro knew he was gonna get griefed by his teammates, poor guy. He felt a hole in his heart, being betrayed and left to die just like that. He decides to turn the other way to get out of the territory. Suddenly, Julia finds himself blocked by a magic barrier. The harrowing realization gnaws at him, because he knows that this is Leona's magic, which means they forcefully trapped him inside, so that he would die fighting the horde of claw lizards. This realization magnifies his pain, as the ones he thought were his friends put enormous thought into his demise. With no way to return, Julia thinks that he can't do anything. Days passed. Julia had lost all hope of returning to the city. The only thought lingering in his mind was the thought of being able to survive his hopeless predicament. Not only that, the Twilight is actually harmful to the human body, which means Julia had no idea what would happen to him if he stayed longer. A careless Julia trips over and falls down a cliff, finding himself incapable of getting up. Even more time has passed, and Julia is now reduced to a hopeless and saddened mess. He doesn't even remember the faces of the traitors who betrayed him. The boy desperately clung to the thought of survival and did not want to die. Suddenly, he felt something. Julia stood up to inspect his arm. What he found was truly shocking. His arm was enveloped in marks that he was unaware of. Julia's concerns worsened, because he guessed that it was the magic of the Twilight that was slowly corroding his body. He had never seen a phenomenon like this occur before. Julia doesn't know what is going to happen. He knew that even the high-ranked exorcists were incapable of prolonging their stay in the outside world, so for an E-ranker, it seemed impossible. In fact, Julia thought that he was the only human who experienced the effects of the Twilight up to this level. Julia knows that his condition could kill him at this point, but he's got an even bigger problem to worry about, as a gigantic claw lizard has targeted him as its new prey. Julia realizes that he's going to be devoured by the claw lizard boss, and strangely ruminates the thought of hunger. The lingering thought of death plagued his mind, and that deeply frustrated him. Julia couldn't fathom dying without fulfilling his ambitions. Because of this frustration, he once again mustered his courage to fight again. Julia remembered his desire to help others, instead of being used like a pawn. He stood his ground and vowed to stay alive. Julia knew that he needed a weapon in order to defeat the giant demon. He wondered if he should use his illusion magic for the cause, but suddenly, he didn't feel so confident. Julia switched to a different approach and grabbed hold of a tiny little branch. Precisely at that moment, he no longer cared, because his body had already kicked into overdrive. Even though he primarily used illusion magic for distractions, and as a means of escape, he somehow managed to pull something extraordinary by forming a magical blade out of an ordinary object. My guy basically has the ability to make a lightsaber out of anything now. Neat. Crafting an energy sword out of illusion. Julia thought that his efforts were pointless, since illusions were meant to disappear. He wondered what he should do, and ultimately charged ahead. Julia managed to annihilate the claw lizard boss with his blade, and that became the beginning of his new life. That certainly didn't take care of his hunger pangs, so he looked to the creature for consumption. 1 whole year passed. Julia has been hunting down creatures and feasting on them. He hasn't found a solution to returning home, and is still exposed to the effects of Twilight. His only means of survival was cooking and killing demons. He could now understand more about the nature of the Twilight world, as the demons living in this land constantly dispelled the aura around them that actually represented the strength of each creature. Holding the mighty blade that he activated 1 year ago, Julia mentions the sword's peculiar ability to absorb aura and turn it into his own powers. Julia thinks that it has something to do with the mark he received on his right arm, even though he isn't sure of the fact. Julia is aware that only the strongest of the strongest survive in the mysterious Twilight world, meaning one has to use every ability at their disposal in order to stand a chance. Pacing ahead, he still expresses the longing to return home. He doesn't really care if it is his hometown, as he favors the thought of any human structure. Suddenly, Julia spots something in the distance. He shocks himself because he has just discovered a village in an uncanny location. Julia feels uneasy, realizing that he was left for rot and survived an entire year in the Twilight Land, only to discover a human structure now. He had encountered many different demi-human species, including goblins, by this point, but this felt completely different. The sheer size of the structure surprised him. That is when an enormous muscular man turned up to greet him. Julia realized that these guys were actually the Cloud Giants, and that he had already learned about them in the Exorcist Academy. Cloud Giants are noted to be as intelligent as humans, and actually boast enormous strength. They're mostly docile and rarely seen to be aggressive. The Cloud Giant is stunned because he has already set up a magic barrier to ward off outsiders, and yet there is a human standing in front of him that seems to enter just fine. Julia introduced himself as a human and wondered what he should really do. The Cloud Giant is shocked and notices the mark on his right arm. They realize that this boy is actually a Twilight human, a phenomenon that was unheard of, according to Julia himself. He wonders if they possess knowledge about his condition. Suddenly, one giant who's got a body resembling some kind of Greek god recognizes the Twilight human and introduces himself as Edgar. Edgar is the chief of the village and invites Julia to receive his welcome. Julia is aware that these giants originate from demons, so he doesn't understand why they appear to be so used to humans. He doesn't detect any ill intentions from them and knows that he has no choice but to follow Edgar around. I mean, he should be glad they're not jumping him already like the last 10,000 monsters or something he encountered outside. After being welcomed inside, Julia has already explained his situation. Edgar is surprised that he was able to wander around in the Twilight Zone for an entire year, which is actually a significant deal for humans. Edgar also explains that the Cloud Giants have a neutral relationship with the humans. Edgar mentions that a human just like him appeared in the same place 3 years ago. This leads Julia to question if Edgar possesses knowledge about the markings. Edgar declares that the boy is living proof of a Twilight human, a person who has adapted to the harsh conditions of the Twilight. In other words, this man is the definition of being built differently. Edgar further explains that the Twilight is supposed to be poisonous for humans, although there are a few who can adapt to its condition, and thus they are known as the Twilight people. The people who are capable of living in the Twilight have something called a Twilight field. The only people who can fend off the Twilight field are known as the Twilight people. Julia connects the two, and the two realizes that it must be due to an imaginary sword. Julia is intrigued and asks about the man who visited them 3 years back. Edgar explains that he stayed with them briefly and actually left a bunch of books. Edgar also mentions that Julia's adaptation to Twilight is equal to that of the person who visited them long ago, if not even better. Julia seeks further information about the Twilight. He knows that it appeared 150 years back, during the Human-Demon War, but that's the extent of his knowledge. Edgar briefly mentions that the Cloud Giants don't possess any more information about the matter. The cause and origin of Twilight still remains a mystery. One word, Zelda. Kidding. Edgar inquires if he wants to return to the barrier cities. Julia gets excited and agrees because he doesn't even know where he is. Edgar tells him that he has a map for him to use. Julia is stunned by his generosity. Edgar abruptly proposes that he wants to have a duel between them. Julia doesn't understand his intentions. Edgar tells him that they're a species that live by the sword, and that he fought against the human who visited him, and actually lost the battle. That makes me wonder what kind of overpowered monster this mysterious human is. He wants him to fight in a one-on-one match, maximizing their martial arts abilities for the battle. His reward would be the map and the books that Edgar has in store, as well as other supplies if needed. Julia is startled but not worried. He has yet to sense any hostility from Edgar, and decides to trust him. He wants to try his new powers as well, so he happily accepts the offer. The two get into a fighting position, with Edgar explaining that this isn't a death match, and that he has intentionally dulled his blade. To return the gesture, Julia does the exact same, and dulls his invisible sword. Edgar is a little intrigued by his powers, and goes on to initiate the battle. In a flash, he makes his advance and attacks Julia. Julia is able to dodge the linear attack with his blade, which reflects how powerful it is. He finds it easy to dodge, until the Cloud Giant follows up with a secondary attack that Julia is barely able to block with his sword. Julia comments on how Edgar's sword broke an impossibility and swung at an incredible angle, hinting at the use of inertia control magic. Julia is surprised that the Cloud Giants are also capable of deploying such a tactic. Meanwhile, Edgar contemplates how his opponent is materializing illusion magic and projecting it onto a sword to an incredible degree. He is impressed by the powers of a Twilight human and decides to go all out in his attack. Both Julia and Edgar exchange thunderous attacks, blocking each other's strikes and returning each slash. Julia knows that he's going to be at a disadvantage if he prolongs the fight. Suddenly, the Cloud Giant manages to create an opening and shoves away Julia's blade into the air. Just when it seems like Julia has lost this battle, He successfully projects illusion magic onto his fingers and pins the blade against Edgar's neck, affirming his victory. Julia had planned the strategy to lure his opponent into thinking that he would win, and successfully capitalized on Edgar's mistake. Edgar fully accepts his loss and praises Julia's skill. Julia corrects him, stating that he is the one who lost, because one of them used their full powers halfway into the battle, when the other didn't even use their full strength at all. Edgar tells him that he still won their fight fair and square, so he should receive the promised goods. Strangely, Julia thinks about it for a moment and makes a request, wanting to prolong his stay in the Cloud Giant village. Julia is interested in training some more before leaving, since he has slept outside and hasn't done much else in the whole year. Nothing was on his mind, other than the thought of never waking up again. Julia learned that the world demands the survival of the fittest, so he wants to follow through with that and train some more before leaving for home. Julia's new goal is to get stronger before he leaves for home. This man is an enemy of weakness, as shown by his second training arc. The Cloud Giant notices the boy's resolve and laughs, stating that he will help him with all of his might. Some more time passed, and the time of his departure finally came. Julia thanked the kind Cloud Giants and prepared his supplies for his future travels. Staying for 6 months was more than enough for him, and he has become considerably stronger as a result of that. Julia is also intrigued by the book he received from Edgar. It contains knowledge about the Twilight world and the demon kind. Julia wants someone else to appraise it when he returns to the city, because it's complicated for him to understand. Julia kicks off his travels to return to the city, and thinks that it's much better than wandering around aimlessly without end. He is hopeful about the thought of going home. That is until Julia discovers that he's still not there even after another 6 months. He knows that he's been looking for the city for a whole year straight, including the time he spent at the village of the Cloud Giants. The bigger problem is that he hasn't really encountered any edible monsters for nutrition. Julia is incredibly hungry and thinks that he's reaching his limit. With his blurred vision, the hopeful boy finally spots the city wall and realizes that he has finally reached the barrier city. He celebrates in happiness and ends up collapsing on the ground. The unconscious boy is then discovered by a mysterious girl. In the next scene, Julia wakes up in the recovery room. He is stunned to meet Elsa Ames, who inquires for his name. Julia introduces himself and asks if this is in fact a barrier city. Elsa confirms that it is and explains that this is the 7th barrier city. Julia is shocked because even though this is a cause for celebration, he drifted off quite a bit from the 3rd barrier city. Elsa tells him that an exorcist training student discovered the boy outside. She explains that he's wearing a uniform of the 3rd barrier city. Elsa mentions how he has been going around as a missing person, but can't put a finger around his situation. The boy has been missing for the past 2 years, which begs the question of his whereabouts. Wait a minute, who are you? Be like. Julia realizes that these people are wary of him and doesn't know if they'll trust him. He decides to be honest, and before explaining anything, he requests something to eat since he is starving for a meal. Elsa tells Sherry to bring him clothes, and she does as she is told. Get this man a Michelin star meal ASAP. In the next scene, Julia enjoys the blissful taste of a human meal after eating only monster food for the past 2 years. Elsa returns to the topic and explains that they've heard of his wandering in the Twilight Zone for the past 2 years. Julia confirms that it is indeed true. Elsa emphasizes that this is not easy for anyone to believe, but it's explainable because of his bruises. She questions what he intends to do beyond this point, and if he is interested in returning to the 3rd barrier city to his academy. Julia thinks about it for a moment. He expresses that his dream has always been to become an exorcist master, though he has nowhere to call his home. Elsa takes note of this and offers him a chance to transfer to the 7th barrier city, becoming an exorcist master for them. Julia is stunned by this sudden invitation. Elsa emphasizes that she's actually the headmaster of the academy itself, and that she's happy enough to extend him the invitation to transfer. Julia smiles in excitement and agrees to transfer here. The only person who objects to his transfer is Sherry, who calls him a liar and a weirdo. Sherry doesn't trust him and thinks that a pitifully pathetic-looking guy couldn't have been able to survive in the Twilight for 2 years. If you ever felt embarrassed because of your stupidity, then rest assured, because Sherry and brain cells don't connect. Elsa introduces Sherry properly and explains that she is the one who found Julia in the first place. She tries to reason with her daughter and tells Sherry that there shouldn't be an issue accepting him into their academy, since he was already a student in the 3rd barrier city. Sherry still isn't pleased with the idea, so she outright challenges him to a one-on-one fight. The reward for winning for Julia would be that he gets to transfer to the 7th barrier city, and if he loses, he is to return to his original city. Julia isn't really enticed by the challenge, while Elsa gives Sherry the green signal to conduct the battle. She asks for Julia's opinion, who gets immediate PTSD because the same happened to him a year back when he fought against Edgar. He still doesn't know why he's being challenged to the duel, but ultimately decides not to return to the 3rd barrier city because of his traumatic experiences with the people there. He accepts the duel, reflecting that it would be much better for him to settle in a new place. The scene shifts, and both warriors ready their weapons. Elsa explains that this is a mock battle and requires a decisive blow for victory. They are allowed to use magic, as long as it isn't dangerous. Both of them agree to the terms. This is when Sherry reveals that she is actually an A-ranked exorcist. Julia is flustered and impressed to meet such a talented warrior at just 15 years of age. He's the same age as the girl, in fact. Sherry emphasizes that her rank is enough to state that he will never win this battle. Elsa initiates their fight, imploring Sherry to strike first as she charges ahead. At a moment's notice, Julia moves behind Sherry and pins his blade against her neck. The battle is already over. Julia is a little underwhelmed because he has already read her movements from the beginning of the fight and doesn't even have to use his invisible blade to clarify their difference in strength. A flustered Sherry tries to have another shot at defeating him. She begs for a rematch, but the same happens again and again and again. It happens 10 times straight, in fact, and poor Sherry is reduced to a sulking mess. Imagine getting your dumb ass handed to you with a ratio of 10 to 0. I'd dig myself a grave and bury myself inside. Sherry ultimately accepts her loss and surrenders. She apologizes for her bold remarks and praises Julia for his strength. Julia doesn't really think highly of himself, while Elsa emphasizes that Julia will now enter the 7th barrier city's Exorcist Academy, registering officially as an A-rank exorcist. Elsa marked his rank as A because he beats Sherry, who is an A-ranker herself. Elsa intends to send him the transfer form and inquires if he wants something else. It doesn't take long until Julia begins his new life, styling himself with a new haircut at a brand new academy. Bro wanted a fresh cut to rizz up the ladies with his all-new drip. Julia introduces himself to his class after explaining his state of transfer. A classmate asks him a question about the rumor of Julia's 2-year wander in the Twilight Zone. Julia tries to keep a straight face and denies the rumor. The classmate then asks about his victory over Sherry in their sword duel. Julia once again denied any such occurrence and explained that they didn't have a fight and just ran into each other while he was filling out his registration form. Another classmate questions his exorcist rank. Julia doesn't know how to respond and decides to tell the truth. When he confesses his A-rank status, his classmates are shocked and start believing in the rumors of his victory over Sherry. The poor boy tries to control the situation the best way he can, but he receives a glare from Sherry. If it were me, I'd be rubbing the L's in her face, not gonna lie. After his class, Julia talks to Elsa, who is the headmaster of the academy. Elsa knows that he must have been attacked by a number of questions since his transfer. Elsa tells him that it's because he is a new student, and even advises him to dodge any rumors if possible. She places emphasis on keeping his Twilight mark a secret, which is inscribed on his right arm. This is to prevent unnecessary confusion. Before his admission, Elsa made him conduct a physical examination test. Elsa told him that, while students usually have a standard physical exam, Julia also possessed his cursed right arm, which is why they needed to run proper tests on him. Julia thought that it was a reasonable procedure because he also wanted to understand his current state of the body. Elsa decided to break the ice and explained that he was affected by a new disease, a disease that is called the Twilight Syndrome. Elsa believes that the syndrome has already evolved through the first 5 stages. Twilight Syndrome was announced as a proper disease a year and a half ago. Knowing that Twilight is harmful to humans, the stages are there to track the progress of the disease. Any normal person would succumb to unconsciousness and eventually die upon entering the 5th stage of Twilight Syndrome. However, this rule doesn't apply to Julia, who has actually thrived in the 5th stage for the past 2 years on his own. Once again, this man is literally built different. Since Julia had already told her about the cloud giants in the Twilight area, Elsa stated that it was the first for them to have heard of the word Twilight human. That's because the humankind uses a different name to describe such people. Suddenly, Julia realizes her implications. Elsa tells him that they're called S-rank exorcists in their land, as they are the only ones capable of thriving in the Twilight area. While she is unaware of the depth of knowledge he received from the Cloud Giants, Elsa explains that his current skills are no different than an S-rank exorcist, and therefore he is invaluable to them. Built different. Counter 3. Back to the person. Julia sulks in his contemplation. He doesn't know what kind of person he is to become, but he is aware that they're conducting research on the symptoms of the disease. Elsa informed him that the students' rooms are full, so he will have to make do for now. She points to the vacant dormitory cabin, which is the only available space for him to use for the meantime. Julia thinks that it is heaven compared to how he's lived in the outside world. Elsa places her faith in him and hopes for him to take care of Sherry. When Elsa departs from his room, Sherry is seen peeping their conversation around the corner. She has heard everything and becomes an embarrassed mess while asking him out for food. Sherry presents him with delicious sandwiches that she made for him, knowing that he doesn't have food to share with anyone. Her kind gesture makes Julia sob, and he eats with joy. Sherry decides to ask him about his experiences in the Twilight world. She inquires how he managed to survive and what he ate. Julia answers that all he had was monsters to get by, including frogs, snakes, and spiders. His words are enough to make her nauseous. Julia explains that he had to get used to it, and thinks that simple food is a delicacy in comparison. Sherry thinks that it's only logical his biggest concern was food, since he was strong from the beginning. Julia corrects her, stating that he was actually quite weak before entering the Twilight world. This revelation shocks her. Julia explains that he was a mere E-rank exorcist, considered a failure, and the lowest ranked student of his class. Sherry worriedly inquires how he ended up in the world of Twilight. She sees a blank expression on his face as he is pondering his thoughts, as if the subject is too heavy for Julia. Julia begins to speak, reminding her of the hunting party missions in the safe zone. He reveals that his leader decided to venture into the danger zone, and they encountered a lot of monsters. Sherry catches onto his words. Julia finally confesses that he was used as a mere bait for his party members to escape. He was enclosed in a magic barrier to be hunted and killed. Even though the barrier disappeared on its own after a few days, he couldn't afford staying in one place, and found himself wandering around aimlessly. Julia was quick to get lost and could never return home. Sherry realizes that he's been through the worst, and that his teammates could have deployed the barrier to help him instead. Julia agrees that it was a sound strategy for them to use him as bait to escape. Sherry asks if he is frustrated at the outcome. Julia explains that he doesn't really care because he stopped thinking about all of them in the harsh environment he was forced to go through. Instead of getting bitter, our boy got better and leveled up immensely. Sherry realizes that the boy became this strong for a reason, and shares a completely different mindset from her. She confesses that she has never asked people for favors, and ultimately requests Julia to train her. Julia is surprised by her sudden request. Sherry emphasizes that she also wants to become strong. Julia doesn't display any worries and accepts her request. A joyful Sherry expresses a smile on her face and confesses that she has been meaning to ask all day. Julia is surprised because he never thought that he would ever be able to make this girl smile in such a way. He's dazzled by her expression and wants to cherish the beginning of his new life. Yes, sir, pay respect to my man's name because he truly deserves it. A few days pass by, and Julia is taking a walk all by himself late at night. He's been training with Sherry as well. Suddenly, Julia is jolted by a feeling of bloodlust from within the city. He can't comprehend if it is a monster that is causing a rampage. Julia realizes that this is not a monster but, in fact, human bloodlust, and it's definitely not normal. The sensation resembles that of Twilight. The man reveals himself and explains that he didn't want to test him with a surprise attack. Instead, he directly challenges Julia for a fight. Julia questions the man's identity. The mysterious man claims that he would be willing to introduce himself if Julia can survive for a few seconds. He launches a heavy assault on Julia, who is carefully dodging each of his attacks. Julia finds himself troubled fighting against this man, who praises his sword ability. Julia reflects that he is facing someone with formidable strength and retaliates at once. He doesn't find this battle an easy one. I mean, you can literally see it on his face. The dude's having a hard time. Their battle is interrupted by a girl, who slanders Gil for not advancing with a surprise attack like they originally intended. Gil apologizes for being selfish, while Julia is at a loss about who they are. Gil and Claudia introduce themselves properly and declare themselves S-ranked exorcists. Julia is at once shocked by the revelation. Gil explains that they're going to be taking him to the number 1 S-ranked exorcist, Cyrus. Julia is once again stunned and wants a timeout to process things. Claudia apologizes on Gil's behalf and explains that they're aware of Julia. In fact, they've been spying on every detail of his life ever since he arrived. They basically CIA'd and FBI'd this guy everywhere he went. They were even able to watch his battle against Sherry Amis. In light of the recent developments, the S-ranked exorcists are interested in making a decision. Cyrus wants to have a conversation with Julia. Julia is overwhelmed by the information and calmly processes his situation. He knows that it's natural for people to keep an eye on him. The unbelievable aspect for him is Cyrus, who is the strongest exorcist and is also ranked first among the 12 S-ranked exorcists. A handful of people have seen his face, and he is dubbed the hero of Twilight. Julia is concerned about why someone like Cyrus would be interested in his puny existence. I don't know, maybe it's because you literally did the impossible. Claudia and Gil take him to Cyrus' residence. They bid him the best of luck in his conversation. Julia is greeted by a young man who looks like a geek. Cyrus invites him inside and apologizes for the trouble. Julia is prompted to ask where Cyrus is since he thinks the man in front of him is someone else. Cyrus declares that he is actually Cyrus himself. Julia is stunned and confesses that he expected someone like him to appear intimidating and ruthless. Cyrus admits that it's a natural reaction that he receives from others. Julia contemplates if the man before him is really Cyrus, as he appears far too normal. This kind of thing only happens in manga, so don't worry, nerds. You're safe. Cyrus offers him a handshake and properly introduces himself as the first-ranked exorcist. When their hands connect, Julia is overwhelmed by a thunderous burst of energy. This magic power is so intimidating that it actually shakes him to the core. Julia is terrified by his powers, even when Cyrus is keeping a straight face. Cyrus apologizes for scaring him and thinks that this would do well to prove his claims. Cyrus insists they jump into the purpose of their meeting. He straightly tells Julia that he should become an S-ranked exorcist. Julia's face draws to a blank expression, and he shows signs of confusion. Cyrus wonders if he is uninterested in the offer. Julia explains that he's just overwhelmed by the number of developments as of late. Cyrus tells him that he's an unusual fellow, which is why they can't exactly let him do what he pleases. He also intends to build an amicable relationship with him. Julia realizes that this is being done so that he doesn't become an enemy of mankind. Cyrus intends to recruit him to their side before he wreaks havoc of any sort. Julia contemplates the highly prestigious rank, the rank that he always wanted to earn. It was his dream, and now it's actually happening. Julia thinks that he has always used his dreams to escape from reality. While he is spaced out, Cyrus asks him where his mark is. Cyrus proceeds to lift his sleeve, revealing that he bears the same mark, just like Julia. Cyrus also explains that most of them are no different than Julia and are affected by the Twilight syndrome. Even though there is research being conducted on the syndrome, they have a lot to learn. There is also the matter of the royal family visiting the city. Since the 7th barrier city is their last stop, they need guards to return to the 1st barrier city. They intend to select talented students so that they can train the next generation. Cyrus intends to recommend Julia for the job. Cyrus emphasizes that humanity has experienced stagnation ever since its defeat in the human-demon war. He wants humanity to move past its chains and vows to return the light of the world. Julia is moved by his words and thinks that his father aspires to do the same. It's what Julia himself is lacking. Julia finally understands the weight of his responsibility and accepts the role of an S-ranked exorcist. Cyrus is glad and states that he is meaning to look for a strong companion and trusts Julia for the cause. The thoughts of becoming an S-ranked exorcist linger in his head. Julia was recruited by Cyrus and appointed an important rank. However, he became heavily overwhelmed upon accepting this responsibility after returning home. Sherry tells him that she's brought the book he asked for. Julia thanks Sherry and thought that he should concentrate on something else in the meantime. He starts reading the book, and Sherry inquires if he is going to read the contents and summarize them in his notebooks. She wonders if he is doing it as a report assignment. Julia says no, and tells her that he wants to get back on track with his studies after missing 2 years' worth of education. He wants to acquire as much information as possible to increase his chances of survival. An embarrassed Sherry asks if they could train again today. Julia agrees without worries. Keith and Sophia are there to tease them on going out on a special date. Sherry corrects them that it's for combat training. She also notes that both of her classmates will be officially recognized as ranked exorcists soon. Sophia confirms that she has already passed, while Keith is hoping to be notified soon. They talk about the rumor surrounding the royal family's intentions of hiring talented students as escorts. Both Sophia and Keith hope to be selected as part of the selected students because they want to tour other cities. Sherry corrects them that they're not sightseeing. The one enjoying this conversation is Julia, who already knows the details. Soon after, Julia and Sherry engage in a one-on-one combat training. Julia tells her to prioritize her breathing and to encompass all of her strength in a singular strike. Sherry tries to follow his advice, but she is ultimately defeated once again. Julia states that, while Sherry has a long way to go, she has been excellently using body enhancement and inertial control techniques in her combat. Sherry, on the other hand, is amazed by Julia every time they train together. She is beginning to realize their absurd difference in strength and skill. Julia comments that it's actually a good thing for her to distinguish their strength, because it also implies that she has been getting stronger. Sherry accepts the compliment, and the two of them decide to get back since it's about to rain. Sherry abruptly requests Julia, stating that she wants to use his bathtub. This is because the baths in the girls' dormitories are being repaired. While they will be fixed soon, Sherry can't bear the heat and is growing restless. Julia doesn't really object to the idea. They hurriedly entered his room because of the rain. Julia explains that while it is okay to use his bathtub, there is one major problem. This unique problem is revealed when the two of them return to his room. The thing is, Julia's room originally didn't even have a bathroom, so they had to forcefully install one for his sake. That means there is no wall, and everything is out in the open. This setting complicates Sherry's request, and the two of them grow flustered. Julia offers a solution by standing outside. Sherry thinks that it's absurd because it's heavily raining outside. Sherry tells him that it's nothing to worry about as she is the one who requested him in the first place. She wants him to turn around and face the wall until she is done. Julia decides to accept. While she is undressing, this man is at the edge of his seat, barely able to keep his composure. He reflects on how a girl is taking a bath in his room, with only a curtain blocking the view. Julia is about to collapse because of the uncomfortable thoughts, and finds himself distracted by the water splash. Bro is using every fiber of his being to resist looking back. I would have failed, dude. Julia tries to regain control by shifting his focus to a different topic. He thinks about being an S-ranked exorcist, among other things. His attempt to focus on a different topic is thwarted because Sherry calls out for him. Julia nearly turns his head, but forces himself not to. Sherry asks about his thoughts on the Royal Guard student selection process. Sherry has reason to believe that Julia will be chosen for the cause. She expresses the desire to be chosen as well. Sherry explains that her mother was always the headmaster, which is why she faced much discrimination. Others would treat her miserably, and because of her lack of talent, she was bullied many times. Sherry didn't accept the thought of losing, and decided to grind until she reached a rank status much faster than the rest of her classmates. Sherry feels open enough to express that she wants to become strong so that she surpasses herself and others. Julia smiles upon hearing about her endeavors and decides to tell Sherry something important. Julia reveals that he actually became an S-ranked exorcist. Sherry is glad to hear the news and thinks that she can't express her amazement in words. Even though she feels happy for him, Julia is the opposite. Julia is muddled with expectations and lingers in the past. 2 years ago, he was nothing but an ordinary boy who wanted to become a brilliant exorcist. He happened to survive in the Twilight and returned to the world, only to discover that he had become an S-ranked exorcist. The world is moving at a much faster pace for him to process, and he doesn't want to stand out in public. Raising his infected right arm, Julia basically tells her that he has been infected by the Twilight syndrome beyond stage 5. In fact, he has shared this condition for 2 full years. Even though Twilight is ordinarily harmful to humans, he gained his strength directly in Twilight. Julia confesses the haunting thought that he may not even be a human at this point. He thinks that he may have cheated to become an S-ranked exorcist, using this kind of power. Julia is afraid of being abandoned and betrayed once more. Julia's words cast a spell over Sherry, who hops out of the bath to give him an earful. Julia barely turns to look back to discover Sherry, who knocks some sense into him. Julia physically revolts seeing her body, while Sherry emphasizes that his strength is not something to be feared. Sherry also tells him that it's not his powers that make him strong, but rather his will to survive, which is also the reason she respects him. Taking his hand, Sherry tells Julia that it is up to him to decide whether or not he is a human, because he has faced suffering and wishes to be kind to others. Sherry thinks that he is a good person. Sherry begs him to be unafraid of people and accept them as they are. Her captivating words are enough to move Julia to the brink of tears. In his reflection, he is grateful someone told him those words. He thanks Sherry, who is still standing completely unembarrassed. Sherry shares that Julia, according to her, represents a light cutting through the twilight. Sherry lets out a smile seeing his embarrassed face. Julia reminds her that she should be the one feeling embarrassed. My pronouns are he, but not him, because I could never be him. Sherry realizes what he means and commands him to turn his face back to the wall while she finishes her bath. Julia's concerns are alleviated thanks to her words, and he finds himself prepared to embody the ray of hope that pierces the world of Twilight.